Hi, everyone. Welcome to session 6 of the 23rd Annual Northwest Interlibrary Loan and Resource Sharing Conference. Today's date is September 18th, 2024. This session is titled Choose Your Own Adventure, Developing eBook ILL Roadmaps Within the Boston Library. Not just the Boston Library, not the consortium, right?
No, Boston Library Consortium.
Boston Library Consortium. I didn't get the whole thing on there. And today our speakers are Molly Dupere and Mark Hofeditz. And my name is Kristen Walker, and I'm the convener for this session. This session is being recorded with permission of the presenters because they retain the copyright to the information they are presenting. They may choose to request its removal from public viewing in the future by written request to NWEL. However, at this time, it is planned that recordings will be made available once captions have been added. Attendees will be notified when recordings are available. To turn live captioning on, click the CC link at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitles. If you have a question during the session, please use the Q&A function in Whova, and I will pose these to the presenter at the end of their presentation. We will not be monitoring the chat for questions. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Hope you are well-fed and well-caffeinated to talk about the nerdery that is eBook Interlibrary Loan. Woohoo! So my name is Mark Hofeditz. I'm the Resource Sharing Program Manager for the Boston Library Consortium.
And I'm Molly Dupere. I'm a Resource Sharing Librarian at Northeastern University in Boston and a member of the Boston Library Consortium.
And our presentation for you all is titled Choose Your Own Adventure, Developing eBook ILO Roadmaps with the Boston Library Consortium. Before we dive in, we just wanted to share a huge thank you to the Planning Committee for NWEL, not only for inviting us to talk to you all today, but for putting on a conference, period. It takes a lot of people and a lot of willpower, so please give them a round of applause.
We also wanted to acknowledge that there is another presentation directly after this also called Choose Your Own Adventure, and we submitted first. I have no idea. It's coincidence.
Alrighty, so before we dive into the presentation, we'll give just a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to provide some definitions for what eBook ILL is, what it isn't, and how it differentiates from some of the other ways in which we can share resources electronically. Then we'll dive into what eBook ILL has been doing in the larger resource sharing landscape, a little bit of an environmental scan there. And then we'll talk about BLC's own engagement with eBook Interlibrary Loan and discuss some of the reasons why we were interested in developing these roadmaps and tackling this continuously challenging issue. We'll then provide kind of a brief overview on scope of both of the roadmaps, both for borrowing and for lending. And then we'll talk about where do we go from here. The world of eBook ILL, as you will see throughout this presentation, is rather fractured, and there's still a lot of work to be done to make it a far more seamless and adoptable practice for libraries. So in defining eBook Interlibrary Loan, we opted with a pretty straightforward standard definition, which is the borrowing and lending of born digital books between users at different libraries or institutions. We found that in talking with our own colleagues and colleagues at other libraries that there's a lot of confusion about what eBook ILL is and what it isn't. And I think something that we really want to note is that as a practice, it is not monolithic. There are many different ways in which you can share ebooks, which we'll go over in a second. The way that we're going to distinguish here is going to use some ILL speak. So we're going to talk about them in terms of being returnables, non-returnables, and controlled digital lending, which, spoiler alert, is not eBook Interlibrary Loan. It gets confused with it all the time. And if you have a differing opinion about that, we'll hold the debate right after this. So in looking at the different approaches to eBook Interlibrary Loan, we'll start with non-returnables, essentially DRM-free eBook ILL. So in this process, the resource that you're sharing is a whole legally acquired digital born ebook. And the note that it is digital born is important in a second. Essentially what you're doing is you're downloading the entire resource as a PDF for the patron, and then you send it off to them in a one-way transaction, just as you would for a book chapter or an article. The patron will then have access to that resource in perpetuity, and that is allowed via the licensing terms that are being negotiated with the publisher of those ebooks. So from non-returnables, we go to returnables, which involve some manner of DRM or digital rights management. In this instance, you are also sharing a whole legally acquired digital born ebook, say that 7 times fast. But the difference here in terms of access for the patron is that instead of getting a PDF, they're getting access to the resource via a tokenized access link or some sort of DRM viewer. So they can view the resource, but they can't necessarily do all the things that you could potentially do if you had access to a PDF. In this case, the patron has access to it for a limited period of time, depending on what your local library loan periods might look like. And a distinction that we need to make within the returnables column is ebooks that are licensed versus ebooks that are owned. Now, the concept of own ebooks may sound a little strange because the vast majority of them are licensed and not owned. However, in the library world, there is a larger push to have libraries have the ability to own materials that are electronic.
We are. They couldn't see your face. They wanted
Oh.
to.
Hello, my face is here. Oh, that's very kind. It's nothing great to look at. So in talking about owned ebooks, as I said, there's a lot of interesting activity happening in this space. If you are unfamiliar with Library Futures, they're an advocacy organization based out of NYU who recently published the Principles for Library Ownership of Digital Books. I highly recommend that you check that out because it's a... Sure. Library Futures is the organization, and the title, I believe, is Principles of Library Ownership of Digital Books. And it essentially, what the document essentially does is points out a lot of the ways in which digital-born resources and print-born resources are not equal in the ways in which we apply intellectual property law. So it's basically trying to say, with an e-resource, this is the things that a library could and should be able to do with it, just as we would with a print book. Again, trying to equate the formats and kind of level the playing field so that we have a lot more ability to share these resources without the rather restrictive licensing terms that come with common ebooks. So the distinction is important to make. Jumping ship to controlled digital lending, or CDL. In this case, you're sharing a whole legally acquired print book that is then digitized. So again, one of the major distinction points between CDL and ebook ILL is that with ebook ILL, the resource is born digital. However, with CDL, you are digitizing a print book. Something that has been an interesting contrast that has come out of the Hachette versus Internet Archive case is the terminology between a digital book and a digitized book. And that's really where this distinction lies between these two practices. If you're not familiar with CDL, you are sharing the resource electronically with digital rights management. And during this time, you don't have access to the print copy. And another thing that comes up a lot of the times is when people ask about controlled digital lending, they wonder about the licenses. So we're not going to get into the full scope of CDL in this conversation. That's a whole nother conference presentation, really. But in this case, they do not involve licenses. You're basing it off of different parts of copyright law to justify the use of sharing it in that way. So hopefully that provides a little bit of background and some context for what we'll talk about next.
So within the resource sharing landscape, there's obviously been a growing interest in sharing full ebooks via ILL. As libraries add ebooks to their collections, their patrons interact with them. A big part of this has been the expansion of online education. A lot of people are finding their patrons aren't in a close physical proximity to a library, making borrowing print increasingly difficult. We're also finding a lot of books are often only available in e-format. So regardless of preference where your patron's located, it might be the only means with which to acquire the book. Global pandemic, that will come up quite a lot, but obviously that put us all in a bit of a pickle in terms of accessing print, both our own collections and facilitating the borrowing from other institutions. So all of these reasons sort of have been reflected in the evolution of meeting user needs and collection development practices. So Northeastern University, where I come from, this fall, 1 in 3 of our patrons are nowhere near Boston or our physical library. We have 2 libraries in our system. One is in Oakland, California. One is in Boston. There's a lot of space in between those 2 places where our patrons are everywhere. So a lot of people are developing e-preferred collection policies, which is what we're doing at Northeastern. As we move into can we, can't we borrow and lend full ebooks, we want to acknowledge the innovators in this field. So the VIVA Consortium, which I had to write down, Virtual Library of Virginia, 94 member institutions. In 2006, they were able to collectively negotiate with Brill, Oxford University Press, Taylor and Francis, and Wiley for full ebook lending via ILL. I was at the OCLC Resource Sharing Conference. Yes, credit to them, where they presented this information, and the collective jaw dropping in the room was heard miles away. It was absolutely nobody could have conceived that this was possible. In terms of the platform side, ProQuest has done a lot of development in platform-based ebook sharing, but those are sort of some of the innovators in ebook ILL. The challenges that we face is not everyone uses the same management systems. Not everyone uses the same ILSs or resource sharing systems. So how can we get them to interact and communicate? And a lot of these systems were built before the concept of were developed for physical ILL. So in addition to that, the workflows that were developed were often developed by practitioners trying to work with what we have rather than systems being designed to work with full ebook sharing.
So if you are unfamiliar with the Boston Library Consortium, we are a consortium, shock surprise, of 26 member institutions located in the Northeast. And our mission is to empower that coalition of libraries to share knowledge, infrastructure, and resources at scale. The power of what we can do via collective action versus the work at individual member institutions. We are in 5 New England states, all of them except Maine. Hopefully one day they'll join us. And across our work, we deal with 4 primary program areas: professional development, resource management, resource sharing, which is the area that I oversee, and finally shared systems and services, which is our newest program area. Amongst all of those member institutions, we have 35 different membership communities covering a wide range of topics. Those are essentially kind of communities of practice and opportunities for groups to share information, share resources, and kind of promote the practice within the consortium. And Molly will discuss a little bit about the membership communities that we drew from to develop the working group to create these roadmaps.
So why is the BLC doing this specifically? As mentioned, Mark mentioned, there are over 35 member communities within the BLC, and this conversation was coming up everywhere. Resource sharing manager, heads of resource management. Why aren't we doing this? Can this happen? And then we heard about Viva. And within the consortia in 2019, the University of Connecticut moved forward with full ebook sharing. They were able to negotiate with Brill, Gale, Taylor, and Francis Wiley. You'll start hearing some of the same names here. And started loaning just in time for the glorious March of 2020, when the COVID pandemic really limited access to print collections. The necessity for ebook borrowing became apparent to almost all of us. And as we all know, borrowing doesn't work unless people are lending. So at that time, a bunch of sort of put together groups were established. OCLC had EBOC and BCOV. I know a lot of us participated in that. But it was always treated as somewhat temporary and the response to the emergency. So we were finding 2021, 2022, within the BLC, there were very few of us actively pursuing implementing full lending and full sharing. So Mark and I didn't know each other, kept being in these groups, these breakout sessions, and just chatting and chatting and chatting. And finally we thought, let's just do it. Let's grab the bull by the horns. So we put together a proposal, submitted it to Charlie Barlow, who's the executive director of the BLC, and created the charge for the group, which I'm going to read. Investigate a vendor-neutral consortial approach to ebook ILL, craft documentation on ebook ILL workflows, licensing, system updates, and other considerations, and explore avenues for consortial ebook sharing and advocacy. So we were approved as a working group. We put out a call for participation, and we're happy to find 15 members. Of those members, 11 of the member institutions were reflected. At the time, Mark shifted from Tufts University in Boston to a full-time position at the BLC, the Resource Sharing Program Manager. So there were 11 member institutions in addition to Mark as the rep from the BLC. We really wanted to make sure we were covering the scope of what this sort of workflow would entail. So we ensured there were resource sharing practitioners, licensing and resource management librarians, and system specialists. Also, from a few slides ago, we're an unusual consortia in that our makeup is very diverse. Whoopsie daisy. Um, so within the consortia, we have Ex Libris schools, we have Folio schools, we have Tapasa schools, Iliad, WorldShare, ISO exclusively. So we wanted to make sure, in keeping with sort of the ethos of vendor neutral, that every single system in the BLC was represented on this working group, and we did it, by gosh. So we were charged with a 10-month period of group and subgroup meetings, engagement with the community, and draft reviews. Many, many draft reviews.
So a little bit of a overview of the scope of the roadmaps. So these roadmaps are specifically DRM free. So if you go back to the earlier chart of returnables, non-returnables, we're focusing on the non-returnable side of things. With these roadmaps, we wanted them to be opt-in for a consortium. As Molly mentioned, we have a lot of different systems. We also have a lot of different staffing capacities, as I'm sure you all are familiar with that. So not everyone necessarily had the means to fully implement this, although there is a lot of interest in doing so someday. So we wanted to make sure that was very apparent to the membership that they were not required to do this, but we would be there, Molly and I, to kind of act as a third-party helper to kind of aid people if and when they decided to implement. And finally, we had some difficulties with the focus of trying to be fully vendor neutral in these roadmaps, because the idea was, well, if we don't include any vendors or mention any vendors in these roadmaps, how can we actually provide the step-by-step actions for people to implement the thing instead of just saying kind of broad generalizations of how you do the thing. So what we opted to do was, as Molly mentioned, be vendor inclusive, to try to focus on all the primary systems that we do use within the consortium. The one exception to that was Rapido, and that is because at the time, in talking with our member library, Brandeis University, they were not sure that there was a way to feasibly make it happen. And as the process had been going on, Rapido announced that, or Ex Libris announced that Rapido was going to start having some ebook ILO functionality. So what our middle ground was the anticipation that we will update these roadmaps as time comes and as more of that documentation becomes available, because we do want to make sure it is inclusive of all the systems that our member libraries do use. So in broad overview of the roadmaps themselves, they're essentially in 3 parts. So part 1, you'll see steps 1 through 3, which is research and planning. So you basically need to get everyone together in a room, do your research, and kind of figure out what the process is going to look like. If we had to assign a singular word to it, it would be assemble. Part 2, which is step 4, sorry, the numbers are a little confusing, but it'll make sense in a second, is the part where you've figured out what needs to get done, and then you kind of break off into individual departments to actually make the work happen. A singular word would be scatter. And finally, the last part is where you bring everyone back together, figure out what the process actually looks like, and then implement it, and then iterate it and sustain it for as you go forward. I'm a visual person, so as you can see on the screen, assemble. Everyone gets together, figures out the process, does their own research. Scatter. You go into your individual departments to make sure that the work gets done. And finally, sustain, where you figure out what the cycle looks like and figure out how you can make it sustainable.
And we thought we had a really great, punchy catchphrase that could be made into an acronym. We're like, A-S, whoops. And we were doing a practice run, and of course we had already submitted the slides. So it's great, but just don't shorten it.
We're taking any suggestions for an alternative word to sustain if you can think of one. So find us after this.
Blinded. Okay, so as we mentioned, the roadmap is broken down into borrowing and lending. I've also mentioned that you can't have one without the other, but we understand people who might be approaching this will start with borrowing. It's slightly less complicated, and you don't have to dive into your licensing language. But as Mark mentioned, between borrowing and lending, steps 1 through 3, and then steps, just go with me, 5 through 7 are similar between lending and borrowing. But we're going to break them down as concisely as possible, but just understand that I might be going into a little bit more detail because of the overlap. So step 1 would be research ebook ILL practices. So we have compiled a huge document with links to webinars, tutorials, presentations on existing practices that are out there. As Mark mentioned, we want this to be sort of a living document, so it's not a set of resources, it's going to keep growing. I don't know if the someone was asking for a citation, if that's included. Anyway, the presentation about anyway, we have a document with a list of resources which exists in the roadmap. So establishing sort of how it exists out there in the world already. Step 2 would be identifying key stakeholders. Often pretty much reflects the composition of our working group. You want to make sure you have a systems, website administrator, staff member present, ILL practitioners, because they will obviously be implementing the workflows, license negotiators, and/or metadata electronic resource managers, and user experience, engagement, and outreach staff, so you can advertise the service. Step 3, this can be often the most intimidating because, as Mark mentioned, a lot of people are stretched for time, priorities are different, but try to get everyone in a room together, even once or twice, or Zoom together. What are your milestones? How is this work going to be distributed? Do you have a potential go live date? But always remembering to remain flexible because everybody has different responsibilities in different areas of the library. So step 4 is where the borrowing roadmap diverges from the lending. You want to determine patron language to request these ebooks. So that can be editing your request forms. Do you have a preferred format? Are you open to either? Just making sure the patron is presented with an opportunity to choose. Step 4B, adjust the staff in request forms to allow for processing. So in the back end, I'm an Iliad school. Unfortunately, there's not a format option for ebooks, so you're switching it to an article request. Moving forward with identifying lenders, you need to determine who out there is doing it. So eBOK, we mentioned earlier, whole ebook lending group, creating custom groups for people that you know already lend ebooks. And then within step 4C, it's important to also start thinking about statistics. How are you going to track this in a system that potentially isn't designed for ebook sharing? As I mentioned earlier, making note of sort of overlaps between which vendors seem to be open to full ebook sharing, compiling a list of who you may know allows for it at other institutions. Step 5, pilot the processes wherever accessible. I had staff members at my own institution try, and fortunately our consortia is very friendly. So reaching out to someone and saying, hey, can you send me a test? And/or can I send you a test? And then step 6, full implementation and share your experiences. This is something that I think has been kind of private in the past, with all due respect to confidentiality clauses that a lot of us have with vendors. We need to talk about this more openly. Talk about who you can share from. Talk about who you've had success with. We're only going to really move forward with this if people are open with their successes and failures. And then we're going to say this a million times, update the process. How it works today, they will laugh at us in 10 years because it will hopefully be more streamlined.
Cool. So looking at the lending version of this process, this chart, don't be overwhelmed. There's a borrowing version as well in the roadmaps. The area that you need to focus on primarily as of what's different from the borrowing side is that kind of center spot where it breaks off into different parts. That's where everyone scatters and does their own individual work. And we'll talk about how that differs from the lending side. So part 1, again, stays pretty similar. You want to make sure that you do your research, do your homework to talk about ebook interlibrary loan practices as they currently exist, get your stakeholders together and kind of figure out your timeline and how everyone is going to break down the work. Where things differ in part 2 is step number 1, renegotiating your ebook licenses. A couple of weeks ago, I dropped in the community area of Whova a question about ebook ILL saying, do you lend ebooks? Do you borrow ebooks? And what's your biggest challenge for doing so? And the most common answer that I saw was the licenses. So clearly it is a challenge. And some of the resources that we've included in the roadmaps to help address those challenges are, we have some sample language from some of our member institutions that were able to share their ebook ILL clauses. So check that out. We've also included some negotiation talking points with vendors that come from Michael Rodriguez, who was formerly at the University of Connecticut and is now at Lyrasis, and also Beth Denker at the Colorado Alliance of Research Libraries, two really fantastic people making a lot of waves in that space. So highly recommend that you check those out to help navigate those conversations, not only with vendors, but also with your resource managers, because they may not be aware or even thinking about interlibrary loaning of their ebooks. So it's really important to start that conversation. Preparing your holdings in your integrated library system. We've included a couple of different approaches based on the systems that the BLC uses. So we have information about IDS, Rapid, and none of those. So hopefully those provide some insights on how you actually get your holdings in place. So as the ILO practitioners can better understand what do they need to check to make sure that they are actually able to lend the thing. Do they need to check, or is there some way you can automate that process and make it a little bit easier? And finally, establishing best practices and workflows for ebook ILL. We love processes, we love workflows, so we want to make sure that you identify what those individually look like at your institution. We've included some of the best practices that the BLC hopes to abide by, included in the roadmaps to kind of help guide other libraries and consortia as they're figuring out that work. And finally, part 3, sustain, or alternative word that we'll figure out later. Practice and pilot, go live, and then update and iterate as it evolves and you try to make the service better.
So we've solved it. Yeah, it's all
The end.
spelled out in the roadmap. No, I'm just kidding. There's always somewhere to look forward to. So where do we go from here? We have this broken down as kind of phase 2 of the ebook working group, broken down into system enhancements, which is a lot of wishful thinking, but something to discuss, the larger resource sharing ecosystem, and advocacy and partnerships. So system enhancements in the BLC, a broader adoption of ISO 18626. We have a member institution that no longer uses ILLiad. They are a Rapido library, but we've started ISO sharing. Ebooks, as I mentioned, it'd be great if there was a unique format type within our management systems. Right now, a lot of us are working with existing articles for ebooks and able to be able to share full ebooks. Support multiple types of ebook ILL. As we mentioned at the beginning, we opted during this sort of initial phase to focus on DRM free, but it would be great if we were able to develop a way to share with DRM as well as owned ebooks. Again, this is the pipe dream. It'd be great if you could push a button and automatically see if a license allows for full ebook ILL. Unfortunately, my experience with licenses is no two are the same. They're all different, all laid out differently. So it can be a bit difficult to find where that language might already exist in a license. And then integrating that information into your resource sharing software, again, it's a big ask, but a lot of us are having to jump between systems to check, are we allowed to share this via ILL? Within the larger resource sharing ecosystem, non-proprietary access to ebook holdings in a community-owned platform. Doesn't that sound beautiful? A community repository of successful ebook ILL license language. We already have sort of started that within the roadmap and hope to see it grow. Involving ILL practitioners in license negotiation sounds crazy, but a lot of times those negotiators don't know what our day-to-days look like. And if they had that information or included you, we could move forward with appropriate language, which is basically what I just said, build awareness among licensing negotiators about ILL workflows. I know Mark's going to talk about this in a second, but one of the licensing librarians in our working group just sat down with us and said, what do you need from me? And one of the points that often comes up is full ebook download versus chapter by chapter. I don't know if anybody here has downloaded a full book chapter by chapter and tried to assemble it into a single PDF, but it's extremely time consuming. And that's something a licensing librarian might not have actually thought about. So just building awareness among your licensing staff. And then, this is fun, educate publishers about ebook ILL benefits and functionality as a collection development tool. A lot of us often hear it'll decrease sales, we won't make sales, but at a lot of institutions, your collections librarian will look at ILL statistics to make informed purchasing choices. It also really helps build a relationship between yourself and the vendor.
And finally, I'll touch a little bit on some of the advocacy and partnerships that the BLCB will be working towards. So as Molly mentioned, we want to be engaging with vendors to talk about developing those item types, so we're not having to use the article field in ILLiad to fill the ebook request. We want to have our own ebook item type, and also to develop workflows to support the workflow. So we are not figuring things out from the ground up. The BLC is particularly involved with Reshare Digital, which is part of Project Reshare. If you're unfamiliar with it, I highly recommend checking it out. Project Reshare supports a software called Reshare, which primarily focuses on consortial returnables. And what they're essentially doing is taking that functionality for the consortial returnables and then translating that into a more digital lending capabilities. So they have a big fundraising campaign. Highly recommend checking out, even if you just want to learn about the process itself. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, we want to push for the support the ownership of digital books as much as humanly possible. Like I said, there really shouldn't be a difference. We are librarians. We have the ability to manage those resources just as we would print resources just fine, regardless of publisher concerns. And so where we are not able to focus on digital ownership, obviously we'll focus on whole ebook ILL rights within any of our contract licenses. As Molly mentioned, talking with publishers about simplifying chapter downloads, as much as everyone loves to download 50 chapters and then attempt to put them together in Adobe Acrobat. So no one ever. And finally, we want to continue discussing this in the broader resource sharing community. I was fortunate to present at MWEL 2 years ago about Tufts University's own process of implementing ebook ILL. And the fact that we're still talking about it and the fact that it keeps coming up time and time and time again at conferences that we want to learn about this means we haven't cracked the code yet. So we need to be talking about this with our colleagues in conferences in whatever forms we can to move this forward and to make it more adoptable and more sustainable and a lot less work than it currently is for many of our practitioners.
And as mentioned, Mark and I were involved in many of those conversations and we're the mouthiest, but we are but 2 people of the working group. So we did want to make sure we acknowledged everyone that participated. I think some of them might be listening online right now. So hello all. And with that, we wanted to provide the QR code to the actual roadmap. And the URL is actually fairly straightforward to www.blc.org/e/book/ILO. Thank you.
Yeah, we're happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Mark and Molly, we have a bunch of questions online, but do we have some questions in the room first?
Oh boy. Oh, perfect. I'm sorry. I am happy to. It is actually in Whova in the session, the link.
Thank you. This was a
Apologies.
great presentation. I wanted to ask you, I'm on the ILL side of this process, not the e-resources side of this process. And the biggest issue that I consistently hear from my e-resources manager is licenses, as you said. Our licenses are not in our shared ILS. Our licenses are in Consortium Manager. And finding a way to bridge that gap so that licensing and the knowledge of what is eligible and what isn't eligible for your ILL staff is the crucial piece of this puzzle for us. Have there been approaches? Is there something out there that we can use to bridge that gap?
I would say in terms of automated ways to do that, none that I'm familiar with. What I've seen primarily from the Viva Consortium is that they create charts and try to streamline the process as much as possible to say, you can lend this full PDF. you can lend this, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. You cannot lend, you can lend this, but with even more restrictions. You cannot lend this. So even just kind of developing a chart, that kind of goes back to the far less automated, but maybe the most streamlined way to just allow an ILL practitioner just say, look at the chart, okay, we're good. But that's interesting. I hadn't thought about the even consortium manager, like completely non-resource sharing system. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, in terms of access to that language, I'm a Ex Libris school, so I reached out to my licensing team and said, can you just let me look at it? And I think if you approach the conversation with, I'm willing to do a little work to look, because a lot of people have, especially licensing folks, their priorities are different than ours. They're swamped. I think sometimes if you make the offer to do the poking around yourself. So I actually have access, view only, to my licenses and have sort of the full permissions to go look for allowances.
Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on that because we're also an Ex Libris library, and there is a way that you can have the licensing like silent, or, there is a way to actually show that in your catalog. The problem is not every the Ex Libris options are limited at this point, and not every license actually addresses those
Yeah.
things. So so that has helped, at least with our workflow, to at least have it show in our catalog. We only care about the ones that we can do nothing with. If we can do, there's some, of course, versus like national versus international, that's a little bit stickier. But for the ones that we can't do anything with, at least we can see that now. But that took us a long time, and also upgrades from Ex Libris to even get to that point. But it is possible.
Don, if you have that like in a document like workflow, we'd love to see it. What I forgot to mention, in the systems consideration section, the e-resources manager folks that were in the working group developed a set of like a workflow to do that within Alma and Primo. So check that out. Yeah, it is one approach of many, but hopefully at least it's a starting point. And if you have that to share, we'd love to include as many options as possible. So thank you.
Hey, y'all, we're running real low on time, so I want to get to some of our virtual attendees' questions real quick. Fortunately, they're not all simple.
Oh boy.
Okay, first one. Have you done any work to renegotiate licenses for material already in your collection to allow for lending? We have extensive electronic collections, but very limited ability to lend that material. So I think they're saying modifying existing licenses is what they're getting at.
I can say when I was at Tufts, yes. I will say that every publisher and every vendor is different. One publisher, they responded in 5 minutes and said, yes, that's fine. Another, it was like 6 months, not even of like having to negotiate, but just trying to make sure the contact for the publisher was doing the thing that they were supposed to be doing. So it really depends the amount of time that it's going to take.
And I think educating yourself on publishers who allow for it can be a great negotiating tool. And in my experience, some of the bigger vendors you think would be opposed to it are actually the more willing. And the reason I've gotten from my licensing librarian is they know things exist. They know things will be shared illegally. So they would much prefer have a professional sort of mediate the sharing of that information.
And this looks like a quick question. Are the members of the Boston Library Consortium lending ebooks outside their system, or is it just within the consortium? That wasn't made clear.
That's a great question. To my knowledge, they are lending to whoever requests them.
One more online question, and then we'll open it back up to the room. How does one go about entering the negotiating contracts with publishers consortia when new in one's position? Oh my gosh, that's a loaded question.
Well, 30 minutes later. So I would say if you are a resource manager, I highly recommend checking out the talking points from Beth Danker within the roadmaps, because she provides a pretty detailed list. She talks about, as Molly said, what to talk about in terms of other publishers doing this, talking about that this is a growing trend. It's not just some random thing we're creating from scratch. So I would start there. I would also just read other consortial ebook licenses. I think those are very helpful. There are some that are out there that I'm blanking on all the names of right now, but they do but there are some that post them publicly, so you can at least get a starting point of what your starting offer could be in terms of your language, and kind of negotiate from there. Molly and I are not people that negotiate the licenses, unfortunately, so we don't have any like direct experience to share there.
Room questions, last call.
Also, I should have started with this. My OCLC symbol is NED, so if you need an ebook.
Okay, we'll go back since there wasn't anyone else in the room that had a question. I'm going to move back to the chat because we had like 7.
Oh, perfect.
See. Can a library borrow ebooks without lending them? Is that bad practice?
No, absolutely not. As we mentioned, the borrowing side is a lot more straightforward because you don't have to look at your licenses at all. It's on the responsibility of the lender. But big picture, it'd be great if that was your next step to investigate whether you're able to lend, because I always feel like such a hippie when I talk about what ILL is to people who aren't ILL, but it only works if everybody chips in. So absolutely, you can borrow. And there are a lot of people in the BLC who are mainly just borrowing right now. But I'd say bigger picture, start investigating your ability to lend.
And we're at time. There was a couple questions we didn't get to in the chat, and maybe we can pass those on for people to answer later. Thank you very much. And thank you to Mark
Thank
and
you,
Molly.
everybody. Appreciate it.